Yeah, it's yeah, a lot of interesting stuff, and that's kind of what you know, Bill Merrifield's idea was with this was the history books have covered a lot, but there's a lot that we leave out, which is that human aspect to it. I mean, what were the things? In fact,
They,
did you enlist? Were you drafted? How did
no,
you
I
get?
enlisted. Uh, are you recording?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I was in college when the war started, and as a matter of fact, I had a medium-high draft number, but my number came up in September of 1941, and I was to report for the draft. I called the draft board, said I'd sure like to graduate before I go in. And Mr. Needham, the chairman of the draft board, who was a good personal friend, said, we're authorized to give you a year deferment if you can graduate within that year. That's before the war started. So I said, fine. I was in law school, a freshman in law school. I had 2 more years of that, so I went back to liberal arts and picked up the courses that I had to have to get a liberal arts degree. And I graduated the 28th of May 1942, and I would not have been drafted until September of 42 with the year deferment, so, but I went ahead and enlisted and just beat the system by 3 or 4 months. And I'm glad I did it. It really proved to my advantage because I went into a brand new division, the 81st Division at Camp Rucker, Alabama, from Fort Lewis, Washington, incidentally, to Camp Rucker, Alabama, from paradise to you know what. But I got down there, and the cadre was only 50% strength. So 2 weeks after I got there, I made acting corporal. 2 more weeks, I made buck sergeant, 3-stripe, and 6 weeks later, I made staff sergeant. And it was in command of the platoon, and then about 6 weeks or so after that, I went to OCS at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So, and a lot of the people who came in the fall of 42 did not get to go to OCS because the programs were filled up. So I beat the system by enlisting 4 months before I had to.
So was the draft was in place before the war?
Oh yeah, the draft started in September of 1940. And an interesting aside there, my twin brother had the first number that was pulled out of the fishbowl, number 158. We'll never forget it. Pulled out. Maybe you've seen pictures of the Secretary of War with a blindfold on, pulling a capsule out of the fishbowl. Well, number 158 was the first number. That meant that every draft board in the United States had a number 158, and those were the very first people called in. He was called up, went, checked in, took his physical, 4F. And it broke his heart. He said, 4F, I'm in perfect condition. He had this wrong and that wrong and this wrong. So he relaxed and went back to school and finished law school up in Gonzaga. And the war started, if you remember, in December of 41. He had been called up in September of 40. In January of 42, he got a new notice from the draft board, you are now 1A. So he went down. He would have reported immediately. He went down and checked out the Air Corps cadet program, and by golly, took their physical and passed it. And he wasn't called in for training until January of 43.
Huh.
And went on and became a B-17 pilot, flew to England in November of 43, flew his 43 missions, I think, altogether, and was still there when the war ended. He was supposed to fly 25 and then come home and be a pilot trainer, but they said, okay, you're going home. He said, not as long as my brother is on the ground over there in France, I'm not going home. And he stayed and flew nearly 25 more missions before the war ended.
Wow, he did well over 40 missions, almost 50.
Actually, he did 43 bombing missions. And then another interesting thing, about March of 45, the Air Force and the Air Corps in London, in England, started a new system. They had a lot of fighters by then to provide fighter protection. And he had checked out in the P-51 before he went into bombers. they gave each group, each bomb group, a P-51 to fly as the traffic cop, if you will, for the fighters that were escorting the bombers. And he flew 7 missions as a P-51 traffic cop along with his group. So he flew 50 missions altogether. Wow. And he's still alive today.
He
going strong.
Definitely had a guardian angel looking over him.
He sure did, because he had some rough times. But, well, you know the old saying, that people on the ground think they've got it much tougher because they live in the mud and the constant action and everything. Well, those guys in those darned airplanes, I'll tell you, when they were in actual combat, it was hell, from the shrapnel, from the shell fragments, from the fighters and everything else. But he took, of his crew that he took to England, 10 men. He was the lead pilot. Only 2 of them are alive today. Only 4 of them survived the war. And he came home without a scratch. Lucky, lucky, lucky.
Now, so you were, when you went in, you were 20?
I was 25 years old. Kenneth and I had stayed out of college for a couple of years to make money so we could go to school. This was in the Depression. And so we didn't go to school until 1937. Got out of high school in 35. So we went to school when we were 20. The normal would be 18. So we were that much older. So I was among the officers in the group that I finally joined, the 100th Division. I was older than the average second lieutenant. Even our commanding officer was only 2 months older than I was. But he was a West Pointer, but he and I are the same age, minus 2 months.
And you decided to enlist. I mean, you wanted to go in.
Oh yeah, I enlisted on my own volition, and simply I knew I was going to be drafted eventually, so why wait around? So I enlisted, and as it turned out, it was a very happy coincidence of events, the way it turned out for me later.
So let's see. So you waited, and you were through college. Had the war started when you enlisted, or were you still pre-war?
The war started on December 7th, 41, and I enlisted on the 1st of June, 42.
So, I mean, 25. That's still pretty young.
Yeah.
Were you scared? I mean, was there, or what did you think?
Well, you weren't around then, so you can't imagine what the mood of the country was after Pearl Harbor. I mean, there's nothing, I don't think, in the history of this country, before or since, which created such a pulling together of everybody throughout society, from every aspect of our society. They just pulled together, and it, believe me, the enlistment offices were flooded with people right after Pearl Harbor. Men from all walks of life, from the richest to the poorest, flooded the enlistment offices. And of course the draft was augmented, as it had to be, because now we're in a war. Well, fortunately, the draft had started in 1940, and they had a running start before the war actually began. But the mood of the country, individually and collectively, was one of, look, those little so-and-sos attacked us, a surprise attack, no declaration of war, no nothing. Let's get in this thing and get it over with as soon as possible. And I don't know, I probably thought the same thing. I was in love at the time, I was engaged at the time, and my girl, then later my wife, now still my wife, we said together, well, okay, you're going to have to go like everybody else. Let's go and get it over with, hopefully as soon as possible, and hopefully survive it and come back and get on with the rest of our life. But no, I at that point in time, I wasn't afraid. I don't think I was afraid of anything. After I got in the Army and and started going through training and the various types of training, then your situation changes, of course, especially the first time you go through a infiltration course and you know that if you stand up, you're dead because there's machine gun fire 3 feet above the ground, things like that. You do a lot of thinking, and you do a lot of, my gosh, what am I doing here? That type of thing. But again, the mood of the country, individually and collectively, was one of, look, they started it, now we're going to finish it. And we did. Huh. It was just fantastic. I wish, without the benefit of a major war or anything like that, but I wish the country today could develop a certain amount of that same spirit, that same feeling of togetherness of, look, let's get the ills of the country solved and go on with the rest of our lives. We're a great country, but we could be a lot greater. In those days, it was a matter of survival. Who knew? Nobody knew whether the next Japanese action would be an attack on the west coast of the United States. If it hadn't been for the Battle of Midway in June of '42, that would have very possibly have happened. Could have happened.
Yeah.
They had the capability, not for launching a major land offensive, but they could have sure done a lot of damage in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco especially, if they'd really wanted to.
They just waited 40 years and bought it up,
Yeah,
right? Isn't that
that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
What was your assigned duty? What did you? Who were you? What did you do? What was your rank? And
Well, I started out as a private, as I said. I enlisted as a private. I enlisted in Portland, Oregon, was brought up to Fort Lewis, processed in uniform, civilian clothes home, physical, and so on, and then put on a shipping order from there, along with a couple hundred other guys, all the way to Camp Rucker, Alabama. We were assigned to the 81st Infantry Division. I was still a private. I was assigned to the 906th Field Artillery Battalion because I had enlisted specifically for field artillery. And believe it or not, I got it. A lot of people didn't. They enlisted, or a draftee was draftee unassigned. That's the way his orders read. And he went where he was sent. But I had enlisted specifically for field artillery, and because I had a pretty good bent for mathematics, and I knew there was a lot of math involved in it. And I was assigned to the 906th Field Artillery Battalion, Headquarters Battery, and got down there, and as I said, the cadre, which activated the 81st Division, had come from the 3rd Division at Fort Lewis, and it was only 50% strength. They had gaping holes in the organizational structure of the division. So college graduates or anybody who knew their left foot from their right foot, I'd been a band member, so I knew how to march, and believe it or not, I made acting corporal in 2 weeks after I got there, and 2 weeks later I was promoted to 3-striper sergeant. And the amazing thing, there were some of those cadremen from the 3rd Division had been in the Army since the 1920s, and were only 3-striper sergeants. And in fact, our first sergeant was promoted to first sergeant from a gunner chief, and when I made acting corporal, they moved me into the NCO rooms with the first sergeant. About 2 weeks after that happened, it was payday. He got drunk and got busted down to private, was transferred to a gun battery across the compound. So I had a new roommate. And this old guy had been in the Army since 1927, all through the Depression, strictly the Depression Army. Wonderful old guy. But he had no business being a first sergeant. I did his morning reports. I did all of his administrative work. He couldn't do it. He just wasn't capable. As a gunnery sergeant, you couldn't top him. He was fabulous. But that's what he wanted, and that's what he knew, and pretty soon he was promoted back to buck sergeant in charge of a gun section, 105 howitzer. But 6 weeks after I made buck sergeant, I made staff sergeant, because I was a platoon leader then. And right after that, I took the exam for OCS, passed that, and passed the boards. And they said, okay, it's just a matter of time waiting for a quota. This is at Camp Rucker, and we finished basic training and advanced individual training, and then we were authorized some leave. So my girl, my fiance, was out here in Salem. I called her and said, I've got 2 weeks leave, but I'm broke. She said, I got the money, get on the train. And she sent with the money of the telegram, the bottom line of the telegram, are we to be married? So I sent her a 50-word night letter giving her all the reasons why we should wait till I got out OCS and so on. I got to Salem, Oregon on Friday morning. We were married Sunday afternoon. My dear friend had all the preparations made. It was wonderful. We had a beautiful wedding. My mother managed to come from Montana. My brother came from Spokane. It was wonderful. And we've had a great life ever since. We were married 1st of November 1942. Wow. So that's 57 years.
She was a war bride.
Yeah.
She had she was here on the home front while you were over fighting.
Oh yeah. She was home all the time. She worked for the Navy ammunition depot up just outside of Bremerton for 1 year while I was gone. Well, that was before we were married. She was up there. But she went with us to Fort Jackson when we were stationed there after I was commissioned. When we went on Tennessee maneuvers, she had to go home because she was very PG at the time, and our daughter was born in July of '44. She spent 2 weeks with me at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, just before we sailed for Europe. And then I didn't see her again until January of '46.
So when you sailed for Europe, where did you?
I was then assigned, after I was commissioned at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, I was assigned to the 100th Division at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, as a second lieutenant. And the division had been activated about 2 months before I got there. So I finished with them the basic training, the advanced individual training, unit training, and then advanced unit training. We did all of that between February of '43 and November of '43, at which time we left and drove to Tennessee, the whole division, and took part in winter maneuvers in Tennessee, which in many respects was worse than combat. There were 3 divisions there, and it was the first time that the Army had had maneuvers in Tennessee in the winter. They'd been having them spring, summer, and fall, but some smart general somewhere said, let's do it in the winter, maybe it'll be good training. And it was, because the winter we spent in Europe, in France in '44, was the worst winter. That's the Battle of the Bulge winter, the worst winter Europe had seen in 50 years. So that training in Tennessee was invaluable in just the act of staying alive, under those type of conditions. But I moved up the ladder from second lieutenant to first lieutenant. I commanded a battery when we went to Tennessee maneuvers, I was a liaison officer, which was a captain's job, and I was still a second lieutenant. And when we went to Fort Bragg, I became a battery executive officer and then took command of a battery as a first lieutenant. And that's the situation we were in when we went to Europe. And we sailed.
Did they put you on a ship? How did you?
Oh yeah, we sailed out of New York on a ship called the William H. Gordon, a big 2-master or 2-stack, what they called a P3, the Navy. It was a passenger type ship, but it was a Navy ship with a Coast Guard crew. Very interesting. And the captain on the darn ship was 31-year-old 4-striper Coast Guarder. And when I first saw him, I said, my golly, I hope he knows what this is all about. We sailed it was what they called a fast convoy. We had 4 troop ships, a Jeep aircraft carrier, baby aircraft carrier, and 5 destroyers. And we went, just about as fast as the Queen Mary. The submarine activity was still very prevalent in the Atlantic. Fortunately, though, 2 days out of New York, out of Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, where we sailed from, we hit a typhoon, a hurricane, and we were in that hurricane for about 5 days. Yeah, I mean, it was awfully rough, and I didn't get sick a minute either, kind of thinking back on it. A lot of people did, but as a result of that, we were safe from submarine activity. They just can't operate in a hurricane. I remember the weather finally broke clear just before we got to Gibraltar, and here this big old rock looms up on the horizon, you know, and the escort vessels were closed in to us as we went through the straits, and we could yell back and forth to the destroyers. And those kids on the one destroyer we were talking to hadn't had any hot food other than coffee since we hit the hurricane. They'd lived that entire time on bologna sandwiches and whatever else, but no cooking on the oh, it was horrible. At one time, well, a destroyer is from the top of the crow's nest to the waterline can be about 110, 120 feet. And where we were the big ship in the convoy, so we were the lead ship on the left flank, lead ship, 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 ship here, and then the guards. And looking off to the port side of our ship at one of those destroyers in the waves, the destroyer would completely disappear from view.
Oh.
And that's what we went through. But
now, did you, when you're going over there now, it sounds like you had some other things on your mind. I mean, you're doing.
Oh yeah.
Did you know where you were going? I mean, did you?
Yeah, we knew we were headed to Marseille, and we were to be the first division to land in southern France after the invasion of southern France. The invasion of southern France was made by the 3rd, 36th, and the 45th divisions, plus some other airborne troops. That was Operation Dragoon in late August, after Normandy in June. They made the landing in southern France, and it progressed nicely. They had some horrible fighting, but it progressed nicely. And we were the first division, replacement division, to come in behind the 3 that made the landing. We walked ashore. We didn't have to go on landing craft. In fact, we got off of our ship and walked across the side of a sunken ship laying there on its side right at the pier in Marseille Harbor. And then we walked. We got off the ship with all our gear, and we walked 16 miles uphill to a place called Aix-en-Provence, AIX and Provence. And we left the ship about, I'm guessing now, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we got to our bivouac area about 2 o'clock in the morning, raining cats and dogs, all our gear. Oh, it was horrible. That was a miserable night. We got in, they said, okay, this is your battalion bivouac area, and we turned off the road into a field that was a sea of mud, and nobody cared. We just collapsed in the mud. And then the next morning we started to get organized, and we were only there about 3 days. We went what they call combat loaded. So all of our gear, all of our trucks, all of our guns, everything went in the convoy with us. So we didn't have to pick up equipment from over there. We had the equipment that we left Fort Bragg with. Wow. To go to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. So it took 3 days to get unloaded and organized, and then we started up the Rhone River Valley, moving up to the combat zone.
What, do you remember what your, I mean, you've had all the training and all that, besides the military part, do you remember what your mindset was like? What, I mean, you're 20-some years old over there. What do you think about?
Well, this is an interesting question, because among other duties, I was what they call the I&E officer for the unit. We used to call it intelligence and education. It's information and education, I&E. And I had to give weekly talks to the troops on just what you're talking about. What's this all about? Why are we here? What are we doing? Going over and taking a chance on getting killed, and so on and so on and so on. And there was a lot of information put out by the War Department, but a lot of it was the darndest bunch of hooey you ever saw. It was the worst kind of propaganda. I don't know who wrote it. Some of it, it was written by a college freshman, I think, somewhere. But there was good stuff available as well, and we did a lot of orienting the troops, keeping everybody abreast of the tactical and the strategic situation as best we could, as best information was released. We had access to a lot of classified material too, of course, which was very helpful in keeping everybody up to snuff with the situation.
Well, what was I mean, before we get past it, what was, you said a lot of hooey they put out. What?
Well, some of it was so, it wasn't Goebbels type hooey, but it was Gomer Pyle type hooey. I wish I had some of that stuff. I should have kept some of those I&E reports that we had to use. You'd see what I mean, but maybe that's an unfair assessment.
What was it, like motivational, or I mean, was it?
It was an attempt. Well, let me back up a little bit. You're familiar that Time magazine is written for the sophomore high school level reader. Okay, now you see what I'm driving at.
Okay.
The material that we got was written for about the 8th grade reader. Well, thunder, in an artillery unit, you didn't have any 8th graders or 8th grade education. Well, you had some. We had some of the, what we call the hod carriers, the ammunition haulers and people like that, bless their hearts, from the coal fields of West Virginia. My battery, for example, of 95 men was about 25 men from Brooklyn, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, 25 Jewish boys. Very smart, very sharp, very capable. Another 25 or 30 from the same area, but not Jewish boys, but still smart, streetwise, the type of people. 25 from the coal fields of West Virginia, who, well, one fellow in particular had, he was totally illiterate. A guy named Clem Waldrop, I can still see him, the biggest, huskiest. Oh, he was a brute strength. I taught him to read and write when we were at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And he was one of our best soldiers as a soldier. But so you had to couch your I&E presentation to not necessarily the best or the most intelligent guy in the battery, and not necessarily the least. You had to kind of try to hit a happy medium. And a lot of the material was presented to us for use with that idea in mind. And it was no easy task. You can well imagine. It was to keep people properly informed, not brainwashed or anything like that, but properly and adequately informed about what it was all about in the war. It was a challenge. It was a very interesting challenge.
When you sat around, and again, I don't, you didn't have a lot of time to sit around, but what type of things did you guys discuss? I mean, were people homesick? Were they?
Yes. You've heard the expression, combat is hours and hours of extreme boredom, separated by minutes or maybe seconds of just absolute out and out horrendous, what's the best expression, challenge to stay alive, not knowing what's going to happen, stuff busting all around you. That happened lots of times, and believe me, we did. We sat around, we talked about everything under the sun. In my little CP group, when we were in that bunker that you saw in the Maginot Line, I had 6 or 8 guys in there, communicators, fire control people, that type of guys, who were the more intelligent people, and we had lots of good old bull sessions. And every once in a while, we'd be sitting there bull sessioning, and the phone would ring, and the yell would be fire mission, and we'd immediately go into action and fire a mission. And they'd go to their particular assigned duties, and we'd fire the mission that might last 5 minutes, might last 5 hours, and they very often did, depending on the tactical situation that we're supporting. But yeah, I was the censor, among other things. All mail that went out from the troops in World War II coming home had to be censored. And man, I learned an awful lot about the men in my battery reading their letters home. You know, some of them were out and out pornographic, if you will, and others were tomes, were beautiful presentations of what they think about their loved ones and so on. But and some of them were damning officers at every turn. There wasn't a good officer alive, and then down at the bottom, except Lieutenant Sherman or something like that. Not that I was so good, but maybe I had them buffaloed, I don't know.
Or did they know you're the censor?
Well, oh yeah, they knew I was the censor, yeah, and I had to sign my name to their letter. But all things considered, out of the hundreds and hundreds of letters that I censored home, I can't remember no more than a half a dozen times when the black ink had to be used. But no, back to your question, there were lots of times when we just literally sat around. Everything was in good order in the battery. All of the logistical elements were taken care of. The sandbags were all in place. The camouflage was perfect. The guns were laid perfectly. The ammunition was stacked properly. Everything like that was done when you really didn't have anything to do. And it was a real job to keep those guys occupied. You only had so much reading material. The donut dollies only came up every other day or every other week, whatever. These are the Red Cross ladies that came up with the truck and served donuts off of the tailgate of the truck. And we had them come right to the battery position lots of times. But you can only do so much of that. You can only worry about the hot food you're not getting so much of the time. You've got to, the smart ones kept themselves occupied improving themselves one way or another. We even had training courses during the course of the war when we were in the static position that people could take advantage of, things like that. But it was really interesting trying to maintain, number one, the fighting efficiency of the unit, and number two, the morale of the unit. And a lot of maintaining the morale of the unit evolved around the availability of mail, the availability of good food, the availability of a little R&R, even if it meant taking number 3 gun section out for cleaning so they didn't have to stand tall and ready in case of a fire mission, things like that. Thinking back on it, that was one of the real challenges of the guy in charge. And believe me, you were in charge 24 hours a day. You weren't working an 8-hour shift. It was a 24-hour-a-day job. Mm-hmm. And you had to keep those things in mind all the time. Another way that in my particular battery that we accomplished meeting the goal of maintaining efficiency and so on, I rotated people throughout the battery. I took guys from the gun sections and put them in the CP so they could see why is that smart little Jew boy in that CP where it's warm, and he can write letters at night. He doesn't have to worry about doing it with a flashlight and so on. Well, when you take a ammunition handler and put him in there to do the communicating or the fire direction work, and he can't do it, he develops a very different attitude toward that guy sitting up there. And I did that a lot, and it worked beautifully. Huh. I took the smart guy and put him down in the gun and let him do the digging and the ammunition hauling and so on and so on. And that created a very changed notion in his head of what they went through down there.
Mutual respect.
You bet, and it worked. It worked beautifully. Some of the units had a lot of trouble like that because of that inbred resentment of, hey, this guy's got something that's a lot better than mine. Well, you change it around a little bit, and it really helped.
Was there, and you kind of answered this with that, a normalcy, or did you, I mean, I've never been at war. I don't understand what it'd be like that you're out there, because it's not like, oh, we went over for a day. We were over there for a long time in this war. Are you constantly afraid, or do you turn on and off?
Yeah, I can only speak for myself. I don't know. There were people in every unit who were absolutely, constantly afraid that, okay, that next bullet or that next shell or that next whatever is gonna get me. And those people very often wound up as what we called Section 8s, and were evacuated for psychiatric evaluation. I had one man in my battery. We sent him out with a Ford observation or a Ford observer team, and he came back after 2 days. He was a big, burly guy, smart as a whip, a good soldier. He was literally in tears. He said, "Lieutenant, I can't stand it. I can't stand it. You can shoot me, you can do anything you want to, but I can't go back out there." And we kept him around for a while and used him in other jobs, but because he wasn't out there where he should have been, he was a scout corporal in the direct support of the Ford Observer lieutenant, and a very valuable cog in the Ford observation team in support of the infantry. So somebody had to go out instead, and the guy who went out instead, as a matter of fact, was killed. He was killed in action. That really makes you think about this. Should I have treated that guy? Should I have accepted his "I can't stand it" attitude and made him go back out with that team where he belonged, where he'd trained? He'd trained with that team for months before we ever got into combat. But there was something in his background, I'm convinced, that he just couldn't stand it. In World War I, they called it shell shock. In World War II, they called it combat fatigue. In Vietnam, they called it
Post-traumatic.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
PTSD. All the same thing, exactly the same thing. And you were lucky in an outfit, in a combat outfit, if you didn't come up with 2 or 3% of your people being affected like that. The infantry, and I spent a lot of time out with the infantry as a liaison officer and as a Ford observer. We rotated the officers the same way through the various jobs. You had to, because of the stress and strain. But I was lucky, and nothing happened to me. I got a few scratches, and that's all. But in the heat of battle, let's say, when the stuff is flying and people are dying, that's when the well-balanced individual comes to the fore. His mental ability to absorb that and to resist it, it comes forward. Whether the people in World War II were better able to do that because of their generation and generational things, the Great Depression, a lot of hardships that they'd gone through, a lot of people. I don't know, I'm no psychologist or psychiatrist, but I do know that it was, you could usually pick out the guy who's not going to make it in combat. And if you check very deeply into his background, you're going to find out, number one, maybe he was a mother's boy, and maybe he was a single parent child, things like that, which led to a lack of ability to withstand that kind of stress and strain. Again, many books have been written about this type of thing, and I don't think anybody is smart enough to say, well, this guy's going to fail and this guy's going to make it. I just don't think that capability exists. but we all saw it. It happened in every unit that ever went into combat, whether they were in an airplane, on a ship, in a tank, or on the ground as a doe foot, or an artilleryman supporting them. It just happened everywhere. Fortunately, it didn't happen enough to really impact the fighting capability of the units, and it could be controlled, but that was a tough nut to crack.
Now you were, and I'm going to jump around here a little bit. You were at the Battle of the Bulge.
Our division, we were not specifically in the Battle of the Bulge. We were in what historians are now calling the other Battle of the Bulge, but at the time the Battle of the Bulge started, on the 17th of December, 1944, our division was on the left flank of the 7th Army. And on our left flank is the 3rd Army, George Patton's army. We're attacking generally in a northern direction toward the Bitch sector. The Battle of the Bulge started, and actually our division front went kind of like this. It went north and south and east and west. So we were kind of a spear headed in toward the Siegfried Line and so on in the Bitch sector. When the Battle of the Bulge started, as you remember, George Patton diverted 3 divisions from attacking this way and diverted them to attack straight north into the shoulder of the southern shoulder of the Bulge toward Bastogne. And one of his divisions relieved Bastogne. In the process of going from a division front on the 21st of December, when that movement started, we had a division front of about 3,500 yards, which was normal. We went from a division front of 3,500 yards to a division front of 15 miles.
Wow.
And we're still in this exposed position. And these divisions went this way. So, and we sat there. We pulled back a little bit from our attack position and set up defensive positions. And on the 25th of December, I'm in a battery position at Petit Redersching, and they pulled us out and moved us back about 5 miles to a place called Montbrun. We served our Christmas dinner off the tailgate of the kitchen truck, and then turned right around and moved right back into the battery position that we'd left that morning. And we stayed there. Then on the 1st of January, actually the 31st of December, Operation Northwind started, which was the second Battle of the Bulge. And the attack was on our left flank and on our right flank. And the stated objective of the Germans was to cut off the 100th Division and capture it. And believe me, they came close to doing it, because on the left flank we were spread awfully thin. On the right flank we had a cavalry recon group, 106 Cav Recon, in position, and they called our division headquarters, said, we're going to, with this attack going at midnight, we're going to have to pull back a little ways. They pulled back 5 miles and literally left the right flank of the division open. Well, fortunately, there was a reserve battalion in the division reserve that managed to plug that up. But we sat there and we fought there for the next 17 days and killed a hell of a lot of Krauts in the process. And the Operation Northwind also on our right flank, way over here, over near a place called Niederbronn and Strasbourg, in that area, they attacked there in strength as well. These were German troops. I saw dead bodies that were beautifully equipped. They had Arctic clothing, they had white camouflage uniforms on. I was with the infantry at the time, with the 1st Battalion of 398th Infantry. And we were just god-awful lucky that they didn't penetrate enough to seal off the division. But because of very extensive fighting over here and continuous fighting on the point of the thing, we managed to survive it. There were several units that were brought in on the left flank, the 63rd Division and the 70th Division, without artillery. They brought in just the regiments and put them on our right flank. And the 101st Division, after they were relieved from Bastogne, believe it or not, they were diverted down and put in on our right flank. And they stayed there for 2 weeks, and then they pulled them out and sent them back for much needed rest and replacements and so on. But I was in my unit with the battalion commander, and the telephone rang. Is this Key Sherman? Yeah, well, this is Smitty. Well, I know a lot of Smitties, but which Smitty are you? I'm Ken Smith. He was in my section in OCS in Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 42, 43, and when we were commissioned, I went to the 100th Division and he went to the 101st. He was a young artilleryman. And we had a talk on the phone, and the next day they pulled out and sent him back home, way back into France. But it was sure good talking to her. I knew he was in Bastogne, but I hoped he'd survive, and he did.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and then we'll come back just as we work time here, because I want to talk about some of the other places you were. But one question is, what do you think the major message is you'd like to leave with the generations to come?
Well, I've done a lot of things with veterans groups since I retired, and of course we look to the veterans as being the most patriotic, the this, the that. After all, they fought, they bled for their country, and that does require a certain element of patriotism, among other things, of course. I mean, you're fighting not just for your country, but for your family, for civilization, for freedom, and all of those things. I would hope that the current and future generations could develop a little bit more, and it's hard to quantify, but I think develop a little bit more of the attitudes that we had in World War II. Number one, we don't care who's first. What we care about are the freedoms and the liberty and the things we enjoy in this country, the ability to do what we please, within reason, of course, the ability to say what we please, within reason. You can't stand up in a crowded theater and yell fire or things like that. But you can say and do and think what you want, generally. The realization that a heck of a lot of good people went before the current and future generations. People who did endure hardships, who endured pain and suffering and the dislocation and all sorts of things, and especially in World War II. The whole country was involved in that war. I mean, everybody was involved, from the little kids to the grandparents. The grandparents stood block watch. They helped to take care of people who couldn't get out and take care of themselves. A lot of them worked at an age when they would normally be retired. They worked in the war industries. This country became the arsenal of democracy. And would that ever happen again? Is the attitude of the current and future generations such that we, the United States of America, could become the arsenal of democracy? I don't know. I have a son who served in Vietnam and proudly served there. He was in the Army for 5 years. He went in as a private and came out as a captain. He did well. At the same time, when he came home in 1972, he had to get out of his uniform just as soon as he could. I came home from Vietnam in 1967, the second time. I got into civilian clothes just as soon as I could. Now that's a hell of a note. And the people who created that situation, I honestly and firmly believe that they're not good Americans. They weren't then, they aren't now, because they can't forget what they espoused in those days back in 67, 68, and 69. Sure, maybe that war wasn't the right war at the right time. I'm not here to say that it was or wasn't. but the motives behind our getting into that war were good. And time has proven that to be true. But be that as it may, what will happen in the future, heaven only knows. I just hope that the country retains enough of the spirits that were so prevalent in this country during World War II, so that if something like that were to happen again, the same feeling of total involvement, of total participation, of total, okay, we're in this together, we've got to do this together to save and protect our country as we know it, as we love it, as we've had it, and as hopefully we'll have it in the future. I don't know whether that's true today or not. I really don't. I would hope that it is, but I don't know whether it is.
Did you leave World War II with animosity towards a certain person or people? I mean, what? Because that's
yeah. Well,
I mean, now we're this global world, supposedly.
When World War II started, of course, it started with the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. I was in college at the time in Salem, Oregon, and two of my very best friends were Nisei boys. A guy named Ben Suga and a fellow named Tal Watanabe, who wound up, incidentally, as the vice president of the Great Northern Railway and as the president of the biggest savings and loan corporation in Southern California in later years, and as a trustee on the University of Washington. Those people literally were crushed when that attack took place, given the nature of the attack, the surprise attack, no declaration of war, and so on and so on. And 2 months later, they disappeared. They went off with all of the Japanese Americans to relocation camps. There was, immediately after Pearl Harbor, there was a sense of hatred in people in this country against the Japanese because of the sneak attack, the killing of 3,000 Americans, which we didn't know about, incidentally, until December of 1942. That was one of the best kept secrets of the war. The total effect of that attack on Pearl Harbor was not revealed until December of 1942. How the government managed to keep it that quiet with the media capability we have and so on, I'll never know, but that's beside the point. But in that era, with the sneak attack, and especially on the West Coast, there was an element of hatred of the Japanese, and unfortunately it carried over into the evacuation of the Japanese from the West Coast, so critical zones they called it. That was an abomination in many respects, especially given the fact that the young men who were evacuated, a great number of them wound up in the 442 Regimental Combat Team and in the 100th Infantry Battalion, all Nisei, and two of the finest units in World War II in the European theater. They did a fantastic job. A lot of those people wound up as interrogators of Japanese prisoners in the Pacific, another program that was totally secret until about 25 years ago. And they did a fabulous job. A good friend of mine in Spokane today was in that group. He retired as a full colonel in the Army. He stayed in as a regular Army officer. Going the other way, I don't remember a similar sense of hatred of the Germans, albeit they started the war. The German population in this country probably exceeds that of Germany. I don't know. That's a guess, but I think it's a pretty good guess. So my wife is half German by descent. Her grandfather came from Alsace Lorraine area when it was a part of Germany. But as the war developed, and as the plight of the POWs in Germany became known, and of course the concentration camps became known, the treatment of the Jews, things like that came out and more of the true picture of Nazism arose, I think there was an element of hatred toward the Germans. Maybe not so much hatred, but wonderment as to how the German people, whom we know as the creators of Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart and Pabst beer and things like that, how that group of people, as a people, could put up with the things that the Nazis did. And a reflection on that point, when we actually moved into Germany and we're fighting in Germany and occupying German towns and so on and German homes, we never could find a Nazi. We never found a Nazi. I wasn't a Nazi. See that house down there? Take that house. That's my brother. He was a Nazi. Things like that. I ran into that on several occasions. But so far as a hatred of the Germans, a la the hatred which immediately arose after Pearl Harbor, I didn't see any of that. I don't think it existed. Huh. We knew the Nazis were vicious, whatever you want to call it, well, annihilators of the Jews, among other things. We saw, as we got deeper and deeper into Germany, some of the atrocities that they had committed. But it was entirely different. When we started realizing how the Japanese treated our prisoners of war, believe me, that created a hatred, I think, as much nearly as did Pearl Harbor. And I have several friends who survived Japanese POW status who, to this day, they just can't tolerate anything Japanese. Huh. And I don't blame them a bit. I've often said when you go out to buy a car, well, some of the best cars made are made in Japan, but I'll never buy a Japanese car, so I buy a German car. I wouldn't buy a Japanese car, not because of Pearl Harbor and POW treatment, but it's because of the way they treat our automobile industry versus the way that the Germans do.
Now, you were also at Alsace Lorraine, is that right?
Alsace Lorraine.
Alsace Lorraine.
Our major combat was in Alsace Lorraine. That's where we entered combat when we relieved the 45th Division on line, and we fought in the Alsace region from October, November, December, and then we stayed after Operation Northwind petered out in January. We sat in a static position for about not quite 2 months in Alsace-Lorraine. And we finally broke through into Germany on the 15th of March, 45.
Now, what the history books tell us about Alsace, but what don't we know?
Well, Alsace-Lorraine is one of the most interesting parts of Europe. It's a region that was back and forth like a ping pong ball between Germany and France. If you remember, before Napoleon, it was a part of Germany. After Napoleon, it was a part of France, and it stayed a part of France until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when it became a part of Germany again. Stayed a part of Germany until 1918, the end of World War I. It was now part of France. In 1940, Hitler conquered France, and it became a part of Germany again. And it stayed that until 1940, well, until we liberated it, we and the rest of the 7th Army, in March of 1945. Strasbourg, the capital of Alsace-Lorraine, was actually liberated in November of 44. And in Operation Northwind, we wanted to withdraw from that sector so that Strasbourg would again have been part of Germany. And de Gaulle said, we will not evacuate Strasbourg. If you, the 7th Army, evacuate Strasbourg, I will cut off your logistic tail coming across France. This created quite a battle between de Gaulle and Eisenhower, and it's well written up in the history books. But the story, that was the basic story. The 7th Army, the 6th Army group, which consisted of the 7th U.S. Army and the French First Army, stayed in place, never did evacuate Strasbourg. But Alsace-Lorraine is a fantastic area. They speak 2 languages, of course, because of all this back and forth. Right now it's French, and hopefully will stay French. When on our last tour, when we were stationed in Zweibrücken, we're just 15 minutes from Alsace-Lorraine. And we went over many times over into that area for lunch, to the crystal factories and so on and so on. And we went into the little town called Lemberg, which had been on the front lines from the 1st of January until the 15th of March. Our front line went right through there. And I spent a lot of time in Lemberg in that period. And there was a fellow who was a German soldier from Lemberg, drafted in the German army, who was liberated. Well, he wasn't liberated. He was wounded in Russia, came back home, managed to get back home to Lemberg the day that the 398th Infantry liberated the town. That was in December. Monsieur Berg is his name. And when we were there in 1970, we went to his crystal store, and we started talking. He spoke pretty good English, spoke perfect French, of course, and perfect German. And I said, well, where were you during the war? And his story came out. Well, I was in Lemberg the day the 398th Infantry liberated it. And I said, you were? And I said, I was in the 375th Field Artillery supporting that operation at the time. Were you in the 100th Division? And I said, yes. And he went tearing into the house and came out with a division patch and held it up. He said, I want to take your picture. Well, the upshoot of that was when Liberation Day came the next year, he sent us a letter and invited my general and myself and anybody else I wanted to bring over for the Liberation Day ceremony. We went over there, and I'll tell you, it was something else. The whole town turned out. The little kids, everybody. They had a town band. They didn't have the music for the Star-Spangled Banner. The mayor's wife was an American. She went to the band practice and sang it for him about 7 times, and they wrote it down, and they played it beautifully. I wrote a speech for our general to give at the ceremony, and he gave it in very good French. So Alsace-Lorraine holds a very special part in our hearts, both during the war and our last duty station at Zweibrücken.
When you were there during the war, I mean, were you in a war zone? What was it like? Because now you're in this beautiful area.
Yeah,
but
it was beat up like mad. The little town of Lemberg was pounded all to pieces. But the people, it was interesting. The people some of them were just tickled to death to have us there, and others were out and out rabid Germans. I mean, they'd been German for 50 years, or no, not quite, since 1918. Well, they'd been German from 1870 to 1918, and then from 1918 to 1940 they were French, and then they were German again. So their ancestors were mostly German, and there was some resentment and some antagonisms, but most of the places, I went over to that area in 1994 for our 50th anniversary of the liberation of Alsace-Lorraine, and we went to 2 towns, Lemberg, Bitch, and Petit Rayon-la-Taupe, which was the first town that our division liberated in France. And oh my gosh, they turned out the whole town. There were 50 of us on this bus, all veterans of the 100th Division. And they turned out the town and feeded us and banquets and luncheons, and it was just amazing at all 3 places. We just had a fantastic time. But yeah, it's a really interesting part of the world, I'll tell you that. Going back and forth like that from nationality to nationality, talking about my wife, her grandfather's name was Demeraux, which is a good French name. But he was German because he came out of Alsace Lorraine when it was occupied by the Germans. And we have a dear friend, Danielle Lloyd, Danielle Desermeaux, married to another colonel friend of mine. And she asked Jean what her grandfather's name was. She said, well, Demeraux. He was not German. He is French. And he was French. So that's Alsace Lorraine. It's a conundrum.
I mean, I got to switch tapes here.